Nature Conservancy, the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, and is now McKenzie River Trust land steward. Our other speaker is Elizabeth Goward, and she works to connect community members to land stewardship opportunities throughout the McKenzie River Trust service area. As the volunteer coordinator for the trust, she works to create meaningful connections between people, land, and water. So now let me turn it over to Brent and Elizabeth for tonight's talk. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Juliet, and thank you all for joining us this evening. My name is Elizabeth Goward, and as Juliet shared, I am the volunteer coordinator with McKenzie River Trust, and really happy to be joined here by Brent Ross, our land steward, to share a little bit about the work of McKenzie River Trust that's happening here in our backyard. So in answer to Juliet's earlier question, I live in the Long Tom Watershed, which most folks who live in Eugene actually do. So Amazon Creek is a major tributary. And so we'll be sharing at the end a pretty cool map. But you can see we actually have 6 major watersheds within 20 miles of the center of Eugene, which makes this a pretty amazing place. And we'll talk a little bit more about that this evening. Before we get going, we want to make sure to pause and acknowledge and honor the Indigenous people who stewarded the lands we're on today for many generations before us. This evening, we're going to be talking a lot about land, human impacts on land, and actions that we're taking. And we want to make sure that we're also acknowledging that these lands were stewarded and actively cared for generations. I'm currently sitting not only in the Long Tom watershed, but on the homelands of the Kalapuya peoples. So colonization by white settlers drove most Indigenous people away from their homelands, usually by force or coercion. And it's really important that we acknowledge our past so that we can work toward a more just and equitable future. Our projects and service area includes the traditional homelands of the Kalapuya, Siletz, Coos, Lower Umpqua, Sayusla, Malala, and other bands and tribes. Today, many of their descendants are part of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde, Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians, Confederated Tribes of the Coos, Lower Umpqua, and Sayusla Indians, Cow Creek and Umpqua Tribe of Indians, and the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs. So we'd like to take a moment to ground with you all and pause and reflect on where you are today or where you call home, and honor those who helped care for the land before you. If you know whose ancestral homelands you're on, you can also add that to the chat. Thank you. We understand that having a role in land ownership means that we have a responsibility to those whose lands were stolen from them. And the land calls us to commit to continue learning not only how to be better stewards of the land, but also better allies to all the people who inhabit it. So today we are going to be sharing a lot of very active stewardship work. And when we're talking about land stewardship, we're really talking about actively either restoring or caring for land. McKenzie River Trust is a local nonprofit based out of Eugene, Oregon, and we work to help people protect and care for the lands and rivers that they cherish in Western Oregon. Our service area moves beyond Eugene, and we actually work in 8 watersheds. Our work is multifaceted and consists of purchasing land and conservation easements that protect land in perpetuity. We also work with willing landowners, volunteers, and members to care for and strengthen stewardship of the lands in Oregon. And we actively work to restore function of natural systems in 8 watersheds from the Cascade to the coast. And we're going to be really talking about that last bullet there this evening. Our priorities when we're thinking about land protection or restoration opportunities lie around clean water. 200,000 plus people rely on the McKenzie River as the sole source of drinking water for the Eugene area. And so clean water has always risen to the top. Additionally, those living along the Willamette, comprising millions of people, also rely on the waters coming out of the entire Upper Willamette Watershed, and those 6 watersheds kind of shared earlier to help sustain agriculture and community health. So we also think about healthy and dynamic river systems, and we're going to talk about what that means this evening, as well as fish and wildlife habitat. We also look for opportunities to help protect and care for scenic open spaces, the vistas and views that surround our area and make this space a really wonderful place
Elizabeth?
to live.
I'm not seeing your PowerPoint. Do you have it up?
What? Oh, it says I'm screen sharing with you.
I just see a black screen, so I wasn't sure if you had started it yet or not. But...
Oh, you've missed a lot.
I'm just seeing a black screen with a white stripe down the middle.
Yeah, it says it's going. You can't see it, huh?
No.
Okay, let's stop sharing, even though I wasn't. Brent, could you see it? And let's...
Oh, I was just about to say something.
Oh my gosh. You even knew. Thank you all. I wonder how many folks we lost.
I wasn't sure if you were started it yet or not, but
yeah. Okay. Let's see. Do you see a map?
Now I see something.
There we go.
A map.
Yep.
Great. Actually, I have a map on both screens. Do you see a quote?
Yes.
Great.
Yes, we're good.
Awesome. Thank you for interrupting. So we also protect working farms and forest land, as well as recreational opportunities in the area. Our service area goes all the way from the High Cascades to the coast. And each of these dots along this map are areas that are protected either by ownership, where McKenzie River Trust purchased land for protection, or by conservation easement, where we work with willing landowners to help permanently protect lands that they continue holding. And the yellow dots are actually lands where we've been able to help support partnering agencies such as the U.S. Forest Service and the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians to acquire land and pass them through for permanent ownership by other agencies and tribes. So late author Barry Lopez shares, to put your hands in the river is to feel the cords that bind the earth together. And this idea of life-giving water is really what drives us to continue doing our work. So when we're thinking about restoring rivers, we often need to look back and say, what are you restoring it to? And frankly, we can't truly restore the Upper Willamette reaches to their previous states. These maps and here show what the floodplain looked like between Junction City and Harrisburg at different stages. Beginning with mapping in 1850, you can see that the river is wide with multi-braided channels. The floodplain kind of sweeps and moves. And by 1895, with the progression of commerce and settlement in the area and economic growth, the river is beginning to be channelized and made navigable. By 1932, the river was straightened quite a bit with this thick line going through the middle. This included the act of dredging out gravels actively, filling in side channels and backwaters, creating revetments, levees, and use of pylons to help buffer. And this is really because the river was our highway. Up until 1919, the railroad did not reach Oregon. And so everything that was happening in the upper reaches of the watershed in regards to agriculture and the timber industry relied on the river to move goods out to the Columbia to be shipped not only statewide, but overseas. By 1995, the Willamette River in this area is really seen as a single channel river. The banks on each side are pretty protected, and it's been pretty stagnant in that state since. The image at the far left is actually a LiDAR image, which uses X-rays to actually look at the historic floodplain underground. So you can see historically all of these ribbons and channels that changed over time. So a lot of this wasn't just because we were trying to mess things up, but because the Oregon was being built. The West was a place for timber and agriculture economies that really built the place that we know and we love today. So we are facing some really big questions in not just the conservation movement, but worldwide around global climate and how we can really address some of the issues caused by development, especially here in the United States. And especially in our region, we're facing floods, wildfires, extended droughts, as well as increasing temperatures, atmospheric temperatures. And all of these can't be solved by a single restoration project, but what we're really doing is looking at what systems make up a healthy river, where are opportunities where we can be really strategic with our work, and how can we help to take out a small bite of this larger challenge. So to begin kind of understanding the decisions that might be made in river restoration, we need to understand what the qualities of a healthy river system are. So it's a pretty simple cycle. Historically, there would be stream cover. This cover, through aging or floods, would naturally fall and provide large wood in the streams. This wood kind of acts as a screen within the watershed, where gravels and sediment can be captured and moved around, helping to form gravel bars and pools. And that changes kind of velocity. So there's areas of slower water and quicker water. In these slow water pools, organic matter can be captured, which feeds aquatic invertebrates and increases just the biotic abundance in areas. And then that increases the presence of fish, especially salmonids and cold water species, who then feed back the forest. And so our healthy river system really needs to have all of these components working together to be successful. So some of the approaches that we're going to be looking at today include increasing the connectivity. So when we think back to those maps of having a bunch of channels kind of braiding all over the place and a really wide floodplain, some areas of the Upper Willamette was up to 6 miles wide at times, which is very vastly different than today. We want to think about how can we provide connections to some of these historic areas. Where are old channels that we can go ahead and do work on? So we look at grading and creating what's called a depositional system. That just means that things can be captured there, including gravels and organic matter. Beavers naturally do this, and we actually really, really love beavers because they provide an excellent model of how healthy river systems can work. So beavers create different grading systems. We might come in and actually use historic elevations to change grades. We want to do this to increase fishery productivity because these backwaters and these alcoves provide safety for fish during high water events in the winter or times when there might be more sediment in the water. This increases what's called off-channel winter refugia or refuge for species. The Willamette River is a salmon-bearing river with salmon spawning happening up the McKenzie. And these salmon are actually a special genetic variety that are native, who are extra important. So creating these kind of refugia or these areas where young salmon who really can't get just blasted out in a main deep stream can grow healthy and have access to a lot of food and organic matter. Through slow velocities, that also helps the salmon, as well as regenerating aquifers as water has more time to rather not just run across the landscape, but to seep in. And this can also help to spread water across the landscape. And this can't be done everywhere. And we'll talk a little bit about constraints, but these are some of the connectivity issues we're looking at. And then beyond connectivity, we're really looking at complexity. So our rivers were used for navigation purposes with thousands upon thousands of logs removed from pretty much all streams in Western Oregon. Now, large wood is removed for recreational purposes. However, there are areas where adding large wood increases this complexity that provides these pretty amazing benefits. So when wood is anchored, it not only dissipates the extreme flows of like high water, but as the water's moving over logs, it actually is carving out beyond the wood and creating pools. And this kind of pool to riffle ratio is directly related into salmon productivity by having these nice deep pools. Salmon have cover during hot months, and so it keeps water cool. It also provides them space to avoid predation. Think about all those hungry osprey out there. And this roughness does dissipate the stream flow. Once again, anytime we can slow water across the landscape, we're allowing time for aquifer regeneration, which is only going to become more and more critical as we face increasing drought in Western Oregon and the Pacific Northwest. These kind of depositional environments come up again as wood acts as a big screen to collect cobbles and stuff coming from upstream. These cobbles are actually used for salmon spawning. They make nests where they lay their eggs called redds, and they need varied sediment sizes to be able to be successful with this. So having a way to capture those rather than once again, them kind of getting moved downstream is really important. And so these pools and these slower areas increase organic matter. Our streams without these areas are actually pretty sterile, especially in the Upper McKenzie, where water inputs are mostly coming from groundwater. So it's not hill runoff where it's bringing in sediment and nutrients and organic matter with it but with the majority of water is actually coming out of lava bed. So this is really important in the McKenzie in particular to have areas with increased organic matter retention. And once again, anytime you add food, life begins to flourish. So specifically when we're thinking about restoring areas and focusing our work, we're also thinking about cold water refuge. So spring Chinook salmon in the McKenzie River are listed as a threatened and endangered species. Again, there's a special genetic variant in the McKenzie that's unique and has a stronghold that we really want to be sure to protect and hopefully be able to grow and help revive a species that's pretty stagnant. These cold water areas have groundwater exchanged with river water. So once again, raising that aquifer is going to increase cold water refuge. We can also raise the water table through restoration by spreading water across the landscape, by working on re-adding roughness elements into areas. It changes the exchange between groundwater and surface water. And salmon are 10 times more abundant in these areas. And this photo here is actually taken in the exact same place on the lower McKenzie River, just above Hendricks Bridge, for those of you who are familiar with the lower reaches. And you can see that the main river is kind of cruising through and turning, but as we turn around, we have this nice alcove behind that's really cold, it's really productive. This is an area where we find a lot of young fish growing. So the more of these areas we can connect the river back to, or at least protect, the better. And a lot of this really is focused on fish rearing habitat. And so fish rearing is the stage between egg and being big enough to be out in the stream. And there's a lot of life stages in that. If you imagine having a kiddo, they're not necessarily ready right away to be thrown out in the big bright world. And our rivers are much the same. Historically, they provide a lot of different kind of water qualities and side channels and flows that fish can take advantage of at different stages of life. So we want to have diverse flows We want to provide areas with slower velocities, because right now what we have are rivers that move pretty quickly on a straight trajectory due to that human interference and like digging them out. We kind of like made a water hose or a trench out of them. We want increased cover for protection and that nutrient capture, as well as to plant vegetation that then shades the stream and provides more food. So those are the basic tenets of a healthy river, as well as what we're really looking for in restoration. But when we think about this and we look at these maps put together and our cities, it's not possible for us to allow the river back all the way onto its floodplain. And so our work is to really reimagine what wild can look like and find places where we can be really strategic and allow the river to have these types of functions once more within the constraints that we have. So talk a little bit about restoration with constraints. And when we talk about constraints, we're often thinking about areas close to the urban core. So we're going to be focusing on Green Island. It's located just below the confluence of the McKenzie and the Willamette rivers. So just outside of Coburg, and it's actually right across from around River Loop 2 if you're out River Road. This island is 1,200 acres, and it's bordered by city on the far side of the Willamette, as well as agricultural lands and some state-owned protected lands. So from the view here, we can see I-5 corridor is kind of in the back here, and this area is really in an agricultural center. So flooding and agriculture don't mix well. This space, Green Island, actually came to us from the Green family, who actively worked to farm the area beginning in the 1940s. Through the late 90s, pretty actively dwindled. And they came to us and said, we would really like to see this place restored. We have some really great photos of flooding and machinery and how agriculture and floodplains don't do super well together. But this is a really dynamic area of the Willamette. So we've done a lot of channel reconnection in this area. So we've removed more than 6 miles of levee. This is infrastructure that was built to harden the edges and help protect agricultural land. We focused a lot on this winter rearing habit and doing reconnection work. So this bottom photo here is actually space where we took out a levee and road and allowed a side channel to come back into a pond that was dug as a trout fishing pond previously. Within 6 weeks of this, max, there was already a family of beavers living in here and working to build dams. And all of this is based on existing swales. So we're using LiDAR imagery to actually look at areas where water has been and just kind of reestablish those. And when we're thinking about these really constrained environments, these are extremely engineered projects. So this is what Green Island looked like in April of 2019, where we had slight high water. The mainstem Willamette is in the far back, and you can see that those floodplain connections and that levee removal really allowed water to move back through this area that was permanently cut off. This area is intended for conservation purposes. And so these types of areas are pretty incredible. At this time, both Monroe and Corvallis were facing pretty big flooding, and areas like this that can take on high flood waters and absorb them on the landscape really do help to buffer downstream communities. Within Green Island, one of our big projects is called the Coburg Aggregation Reclamation Project. We call it CARP, even though it's full of bass. And this area were isolated gravel ponds that were used to help build the I-5. So it's a gravel quarry. Most ponds in this area are not natural ponds are not a supernatural feature generally in the Northwest. And so, but we have them everywhere because they're the main ways that we extract gravel, which build the I-5 and roads. This project was highly engineered. It sits at the borderland of some neighboring farms and agricultural fields. And so we really wanted to we did a lot of hydrologic modeling to make sure that when we did this work, we weren't increasing flood potential for our neighbors. During that April 2019 flood, water actually started flowing out of the project area and back towards the river rather than into neighboring farm fields. And this project reconnected the historic McKenzie River back into the floodplain. We have found juvenile spring Chinook salmon using these ponds, which were previously isolated and providing pretty big hazards, not just to people, but algal blooms as well as invasive species. And this allows for seasonal inundation, meaning that when the river gets high in the nearby Willamette, this area can kind of fill up and absorb and provide a special refuge for different animals. And this process is messy. So I wanted to share a couple of photos with you because Brent's going to share a little bit about process-based restoration in a second. But doing this doesn't generally look like restoring. It looks like a bunch of big, heavy equipment driving and pushing dirt around. Here we regraded the ponds and built a new channel. And this bottom corner of a couple folks are looking out on the area about 5 years post-implementation. And this is what it looks like today. This area is reconnected in. It's providing habitat for not just fish, there are also western pond turtles. And this is a fantastic place to bird for waterfowl. And one of the really cool things about this restoration story is the Oregon chub, who are endemic, meaning it's the only place they live, to the Willamette River. They were found in the middle McKenzie, lower McKenzie, back in the early 1990s. And it's an area that we've worked on a lot with Chub Reclamation. And a couple of years ago at Green Island, we found a population in the Willamette River for the first time since 1967 there at Green Island. So this type of work is providing direct results and impacts. Oregon chub are the first freshwater fish to ever be delisted from endangered species category due to survival or due to population recovery rather than extinction. So I'm going to have Brent share a little bit about what restoration might look like in areas with less constraints. Thinking about that constraints are really within, like thinking about built infrastructure and humans around us. So Brent.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I get control of your screen to go through these?
No, but I'll do a good job.
Okay. All right, yeah. So let's go ahead and, so we currently have a large floodplain restoration project upriver, Finrock Reach. We own property up there. We own the boat launch, and then 240 acres of Finrock Reach that we're restoring. So we'll talk about this process-based approach to stream restoration. So there's about 8 stages through a river restoration, or that a river takes through its process. So all the way through stage 0 up to stage 8, you can see the different stages of what's happening with the river. So what we have is we have a historic elevation with a channel, and what's happened over time is that channel has become cut down below its historic elevation, or channelized, or head cutting, some people refer to it as that. So what this stage-based process does is it looks at taking that river that's been incising and getting it back out onto its bank through various stages. And typically what you work with is a stage 0, which is kind of your full extent. You're bringing your target elevation, your grade back up to a historic level to get rid of some of that head cutting and channelizing that happens. And so what we're working on up there is actually, it's not a stage 0, it's a stage 8. So you don't bring that target elevation quite up as high. And part of that is due because we are working adjacent to the mainstem McKenzie. And when you look at these projects, typically you're looking at wide, valley-wide areas with opportunity to reconnect that floodplain. And being adjacent to the mainstem McKenzie, we're limited to a stage 8. So that elevation is a little bit lower and you have a little bit higher water typically. This photo right here is a really good example of the two. On the left is the mainstem McKenzie, and on the right, this is the South Fork McKenzie, and that project where it meets the mainstem. So you can kind of get an idea of what those two look like. Pretty cool. All right, next slide. Yeah, so the process-based projects in the Willamette Valley. There's a few of these that have happened. Staley Creek, United States Forest Service, and Middle Fork Watershed Council project. That's kind of like your Oak Ridge drainage. There's a multi-phase project up at Deer Creek, again, Forest Service and McKenzie Watershed Council. And then South Fork McKenzie below Cougar Reservoir. That is a multi-phase project as well, with 2 phases complete and potentially up to 5 phases in that project. So that's pretty exciting. And then with us, the Finn Rock Reach project. And this is one thing I really want to point out here is it's a really unique opportunity to be working alongside with the Forest Service, as they have been pretty instrumental in developing this stage-based restoration project. It's been an evolution over many, many years of kind of trial and error and stream river restoration projects. And there's a group of fish biologists that have been working over on the coast and out of Bend, Deschutes, and McKenzie district. And basically, over time, through trial and error and kind of accident, they've come to realize that getting water onto the floodplain has been the most beneficial. So over time, they've tried to really do more engineered projects, wood placement, but not really looking at like, what are the impacts from raising and reconnecting floodplains? And what they found is that those are the most beneficial. And so what these process-based restoration projects do is mimic that and get that floodplain back, raise that water table back up. The McKenzie is a single thread system. And the problem with that is there's little area for off-channel refuge, like Elizabeth was explaining. And the most important habitat that you can provide for salmonid species is that side channel, off channel habitat. And with that really being limited in the McKenzie, our Finn Rock Reach project site offered a great opportunity. It's pretty wide. Like I said, it's not valley wide because we have the main stem, but it offers a really wide area to work within. So this project is also unique as well because there was an existing gravel pond on this site. And what that did, okay, Elizabeth, you want to go to the next slide? I think it's the one that shows the mainstem McKenzie over time. Or just a little more context too. Finn Rock Reach, this is the project area in red. There we go. So in our red outline here, this is our project area. And you can see through time how the McKenzie used to be more towards the north top end of the project. Elizabeth, can you kind of highlight that with your cursor? Right there. So 1945. And then as we go through, you can see that the mainstem McKenzie has migrated down south to the bottom. And so what we have is that whole middle area right there that we're working with, restoration. So with these process-based restoration projects, is basically it's a cut and fill game. So we're going in, we're setting a target elevation, And from that target elevation, that determines more or less our depth. And what kind of the primary goal of these projects is to increase our wetted area and also some complex reconnecting channels. Elk Creek runs to the north of the project. It does historically have salmon spawning habitat, but with little rearing habitat. And the rearing habitat is really important for the juvenile fish. So we did have some spawning, but what this project is going to do is it's going to increase that area, that rearing and that spawning area, like dramatically. And so what this diagram shows is on the left, that's before as conditions exist now with Elk Creek channel to the north. And then on the right, it shows, and then that's the gravel pond in the middle. And then the diagram on the right shows how much more wetted area we're going to get through the project. And keep in mind with this too, it's important to look that the mainstem McKenzie is along the bottom. So the project area, Elk Creek side channel is all to the top, to the north. So yeah, so this is a multi-phase project. We're currently in phase 1 of this project. It started in June. And we have an in-water window that we have to work with. So that's considering the return of spawning salmon. So we have till end of August to complete the work. And we're approximately about 85% done with the project. We work with local contractors that implement the project. And like I was saying before, the Forest Service, it's a really unique situation where we're the landowner, the Forest Service implements the design, and then we have some engineers out of Portland that show us some modeling of what water will do through the site. But it's more or less Forest Service design, and they have the expertise of doing these projects. They've implemented them in South Fork McKenzie and Deer Creek and a lot of other areas across the state. And again, this diagram shows that increase of wetland waters in the light blue of what we're going to get out of this project. So it's just awesome. The amount of rearing and spawning habitat that's increasing is just amazing. It's just a construction design map. And so what these projects do, like I said, it's cut and fill. So 115,000 cubic yards of cut material, lots of large wood placement. There's approximately 800 large root wad trees, 700, it's called slap or racking trees, and those are a little bit smaller diameter trees. And within this project area, within these channels, we create these wood structures. And there's a recipe that we use to create these. And like Elizabeth was explaining earlier, these wood structures are really important for adding complexity to the system. They help slow, they help sort and build different pools, riffles, and really hold sediment, sort sediment, and contribute to those really nice alluvial material that we like to see in rivers for spawning. And part of this site too is, if you could go back to that last map, Elizabeth. So all that cut material went into the pond area, and that pond area had really limited habitat. There were 2 species of turtles, western pond turtles and painted turtles that use that habitat, but that habitat for the turtles was really limited. They need a certain slope for nesting, and that pond had really steep cut banks that provided very little habitat for nesting. So what we're doing with this project is we're taking all of that cut material in our project area in those channels, and we're filling in that pond, and we're creating leave islands for turtle nesting. So they're gonna have a lot more nesting habitat, which is gonna be awesome. And we're creating different pond spots for them. So it's not just gonna be all filled in. And one thing to point out with this project too, is there is a phase 2 that's gonna make greater connections in that pond area to the main stem. So after completion of phase 2, we're gonna have a lot more water flowing through the whole site. And in that existing pond area where the turtle habitat's gonna be, there's gonna be a lot more water. So yeah, so I think one thing that's neat to think about with this project too is that, you know, in order for it to be successful, you have to have more than just like one little piece. If this was just one site, yeah, it'd be great, it'd be awesome. But really what we're looking at, especially with the Forest Service, is the ability to do this valley-wide in the McKenzie, in the middle upper McKenzie up there. And with the work that the Forest Service has been doing with the McKenzie Watershed Council on the South Fork, and also in Deer Creek, there's more opportunity in other drainages to do more of this type of work. So really looking at that as like creating more of this habitat instead of like a smaller isolated piece. If we can get more of these stage-based projects, we just have a much greater area, and that's going to be much more beneficial. All right, so yeah, restoration timeline. Kind of talked about that. It's cut and fill. One thing that is important with these projects is just really being able to be adaptable. As you know, there's kind of a way to do them as you implement these projects. Things come up, things change. This is the first project that is adjacent to a mainstem. South Fork and Deer Creek are not on a mainstem, they're their own tributary. So a much smaller project as far as the width of the river channel. Yeah, so throughout these projects too, we do a lot of pre-project monitoring, looking at vegetation, looking at aquatic insects, pre and post monitoring. And they've seen a lot of really good results in that South Fork. The amount of reds, historically, there's a slide, I think that's coming up soon, Elizabeth. Just the amount of red salmon spawning reds that are in the project prior to these projects were really small. I mean, I think that we could get to that slide.
It was 2 within like 50 years is the max amount. And this is in the South Fork project. So it's upstream and it's a little different. But there was a return of more than 240 reds within the first year of what's we're say rewatering, but when water was moved back through the areas. So that's a pretty incredible biotic response. We'll look at a couple of those facts too. But yeah, South Fork was pretty incredible. And we will be rewatering Fin Rock. So more incredible salmon numbers coming at you mid-September.
Yeah. And again, what these projects do is they increase the amount of food in the system for salmonid species. So it's something that the salmon are keying in on this. We're not really sure exactly why, but they're coming to these areas immediately after they're completed. They're digging reds, and the thought is that there's just so much food and there's so much productivity in these areas that they're wanting to stay in. Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife has been doing some survey work up on South Creek this year, and they're seeing juvenile fish that are staying in the system that are like huge, like 10 inches, and they should already be like out to the ocean. And the thought is with what they think might be happening is that there's just so much food provided in these areas and these restoration projects that there's no need for them to head out to the ocean. That's one of the main reasons why salmon go to the ocean, is to eat and grow. And so it's pretty cool to see that. And that's real early. That's just happened this year. So what an interesting thing to point out.
Great. So this restoration kind of on the ground, thinking about Fin Rock. And then if you do, just want to remind people, if you do have questions, we do have a question and answer period coming up. But once we've gotten going, we've really been working on protecting the mainstem McKenzie as seen here, for both water quality from just kind of the impacts of driving this large machinery around. And so currently there are these kind of bags in there for anybody who might have fished or raft or kayaked by. Had a lot of folks pause and ask. These are just temporary. And then we really get into this channel creation in here. So historically, Brent talked a lot about like raising the elevation, and it's really raising it back to a historic level. And so some of the impacts of upstream dams and the river channelization work that happened for moving timber up and down the McKenzie is that it really dropped and kind of degraded the channel. And not having really big floods, because most of our western rivers are controlled by dams, means it doesn't get this natural process. So we're actually coming in and kind of acting like a flood that might kind of scoop out earth, and we're using historic LIDAR and elevation levels to do that. So here you can see in the center of the island, crews are working to actually create channels, and we can tell that the river's been here by all the cobble beneath. This is an awesome aerial shot that Brent took. Brent has done some amazing drone work for us of work at the farthest bottom tip. Elk Creek is here at the top, and then the McKenzie is here. And these are channels and what we call leave islands. So areas where we'll be replanting. This area was impacted by the Holiday Farm fire in 2020. And so these will be replanted and act as wetlands or stream adjacent wetlands, which means sometimes they're flowing. After that, we get into our large wood, like we talked about, all those great benefits, and we really make a mess. At the bottom of the project area, most of the wood at the bottom is actually buried 40 to 60%. So these are thinking 20 feet plus in the ground. So these logs are really secured. And so these are going to buffer if there's movement upstream. These are going to buffer them. It's going to take a lot of force to actually move them out of the project area. So we think of them as kind of like catch logs down at the bottom. So although it looks like some pickup sticks, here there is actual burying work happening to anchor these in place pretty strategically based on flow. Throughout this, staff are using GPS and monitoring these historic elevations. This is a really highly engineered project, as Brent shared, by the Forest Service, as well as Wolfwater Resources out of Portland, Oregon. And so we're using those historic elevations and checking them to ensure that this work is at the correct elevation so that it's not creating adverse impacts on either Oregon 126 on one side or the mainstem McKenzie River on the other.
They're highly engineered, but in a way they're not. They mimic, I mean, they're not, they try to mimic a natural process. So we do expect
highly modeled.
Highly modeled, yes. Some of those logs over time, we do expect to move and natural changes and shifts to happen and more wood to come in. So it's like they are engineered, but they mimic a natural process, and they are pretty actually natural.
Yeah. Before we move water, so one of the biggest areas is the Elk Creek side channel that Brent had pointed out. This is where spring Chinook salmon spawning has been happening. And so this is an area that is getting a lot of added wood. First, we had to salvage fish. So you can see here we have partners. We have the Coast Fork Willamette Watershed Council's youth crew out, community volunteers, Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, staff and other partners out, moving fish out of the Elk Creek area before we temporarily divert the water. And so this project was really cool in its approach because we actually built the wetland and slower stream side channels to divert this into, rather than a temporary diversion stream, which would have just pumped everything out to the McKenzie. So once fish have been salvaged, as well as kind of at the same time, we began diverting the water, the Elk Creek channel across the floodplain. And as water was lowered, crews were working to get fish out. And then currently we're working on increasing those stream bed elevations. Once again, providing that kind of lateral connectivity between across the floodplain, between side channel wetland complexes, and then in high water events, the McKenzie River. And currently staff are working on finishing up large wood placement in this area. So as Brent said, this is about at 85% complete. The Finrock first phase, which really focuses on those lower wetland complexes, and the Elk Creek restoration specific for improving the salmon spawning habitat on the site. And upcoming is the rewatering of Elk Creek, which, as Brent said, will be taking place within that salmon safe window. Spring Chinook salmon are in the system, and they generally begin showing up in mid-September to this site. So we'll be all wrapped up by end of August. And so, as Brent said, this is happening not just in this isolated project. This project area we've been sharing with you is about 84 acres with an additional 50 acres with some overlap of that in the floodplain. But this is really building on this network of community investments in this type of restoration for the Middle McKenzie Valley. And so this map, you can see just really briefly the entire Middle McKenzie floodplain. These areas that look really flat, that's historically where that river is. Thinking back to those Willamette slides with lots of braided and meandering channels, the McKenzie was much the same. And so Finrock builds upon a network of other projects. Like Brent said, creating more and more abundance of these areas is going to have the best impacts on salmon and overall like watershed health, storage capacity, and some of these larger climate impacts that really need to be approached at scale. And all of this not just helps to save salmon and improve water quality and protect aquifers, but it also improves habitat for plenty of other critters, including red-legged frogs. As Brent said, increasing turtle nesting habitat was a really big part of this project based on presence of Western pond turtles and Western painted turtles, both of whom, based on our surveying, were not being very successful in their juveniles making it to adulthood in that area, or even their eggs being able to hatch. There's really high predation rates. Trading terrestrial or like land for aquatic habitat has a multitude of benefits as far as supporting riparian floodplain forest and the birds and animals that rely on them in the area. And then, of course, a part of all of this work is also addressing invasive species and increasing native plant diversity. This is especially important at the Finrock and the Middle McKenzie context due to the impacts of the Holiday Farm fire and some landscape-wide kind of vulnerabilities to invasive species move. And then beyond just salmon, bull trout are also listed as a threatened and endangered species. And when we look at the McKenzie watershed map, we can see these yellow and orange are these overlapping areas where both species are found. So not only salmon focus, but other fish species are also relying on these types of approaches within our watersheds as giving them a better chance of success, especially within a changing climate future. Brent shared this kind of response, like, well, how do you know it works? We don't yet because it's really early, but early indicators do show that salmon respond really strongly to this type of restoration. Once again, with that South Fork enhancement project, going from having about 2 salmon reds, or those are their egg nests, to more than 230. So 2 were found in 42 years, and then the year after rewatering, 230. That's pretty incredible. So, and then we can't ever do any slides at McKenzie River Trust without including our friend the beaver, who also does this restoration, but on a much smaller scale. And we did do beaver monitoring in the area as well with multiple familial units. And the beavers will actually help to maintain these wetlands and grow these areas that then in turn continue to benefit multiple other species. So that's a whole lot about restoration. And we would love to answer any lingering questions that folks might have. Sorry for the slideshow not working at first. And I will stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth and Brent, for that. I really appreciate that. And I think we've learned a lot about river restoration projects and how complex it is. I had no idea. So thank you for enlightening us on that. And again, to remind people to put any questions in the Q&A box. We have a couple already, so I'm going to turn it over to Sharon to handle those.
Yeah, and I'll also let everyone know that I've now put into the chat a link from these, sorry, from everyone, of the watersheds in our area. So from Elizabeth and Brent. So if you want to double check your answer, do that at some point, and we'll get on to the questions. We've got one question, which I imagine is kind of wandering through everybody's minds as you talked about the holiday fire and its effect last year on your work with the Finn Rock project and how it's going to affect things going forward.
That is a great question. I wanted to talk about that, but we ran out of time. It's easy to just go on about these projects. No, these projects, like what we're seeing, so South Fork, 2 phases completed. Holiday Farm Fire ripped through that area. It was one of the hottest burning areas. And what they've seen in that is that because of you're increasing your wetland, you're bringing your water table up. There's so much more water in there now that it burned through there, but it didn't burn through their project and destroy everything. What they've seen is, here's a good example. There's a lot of sword ferns that have burned. And what we've seen, I did a lot of assessments upriver for 6 months post-holiday farm fire. And sword ferns, for example, a lot of those crowns have just like scorched. And like there's some regrowth, there's some regeneration. But what they've seen in that South Fork project on sword fern crowns is that they didn't burn to a crisp. They more or less like wilted. So the thought is that those plants have way more access to water. They're way more hydrated. And so the burn severity through those project areas looks like it's lower. And there's so much wood in those sites, large place wood, that you would think a fire at that magnitude, that hot, would just burn everything up. Well, it didn't. I mean, the wood is still in the river. So these do act as a way to mitigate fire, at least alleviate or drop the fire intensity. The Deer Creek project, there was a fire burning up there that is north of Belknap Hot Springs. We had photos sent, Forest Services up there working on those fires to the fish bios working on our project. And it's kind of the same story. They didn't burn, the burn severity dropped. So pretty impressive to see that firsthand.
Yeah, so that you're saying that not only it hasn't affected your project, really, well, I suppose it set it back some, but in the future, this is a way to mitigate the intensity of fires.
Yeah, I mean, if you
Wow.
think about it, you're increasing your your water table. You're bringing your water table up. Your your wetland area is increased. But it's got to have an impact. So in a positive direction for fire.
Well, as a follow-up then, do you find that with the heat we've had this summer, you're seeing less scorching on trees that are in these areas?
I think it's too early to tell that. There's, these trees, they've been under so much stress, and they just went through like a major fire, and now a lot of heat and no rain. So I think it's too early to really answer that question. I think time will tell, in the next 5 to 10 years, once we have some regeneration post-fire. We're going to do some replanting on our site, but we're also curious to see what will come up naturally as you bring that water table up. And you also have post-fire conditions. So like, what's going to happen with that? So a lot of factors in there right now.
Okay. And we've got a question. Somebody's interested in just what all of this costs. So they've asked what the cost of completing a project like this is. So they're curious if the restoration benefits bring any long-term return on whatever it cost. Or are the benefits really less financial and say more of an environmental benefit? They do want to mention that it's not that they say it should only be beneficial if there's a financial return. They're just curious.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And the answer is a lot of money. So this FINROC project is budgeted around $8 million total. But within that, some of the outcomes, the joke we have in the office is, each salmon whose native salmon that comes back up to spawn ends up costing through federal and state agencies over all of these different financial inputs about $20,000 a head. So when you break it down, and that's a really complicated and oversimplified way to put together a pretty complicated system. But I think as far as running in-depth cost benefit analysis, what we're really focusing on are some of the extreme and urgent pressures of climate change, as well as species loss. Salmon in particular are not only facing issues within the freshwater environment, but surface stream temperatures and acidifying oceans are also impacting life stages, with most recent research done on Columbia salmon showing that increasing smolt populations might be the only way to save spring Chinook salmon. And if you're not totally familiar with all the touches that salmon make in their life cycles for not only forest health, but then oceanic health, it's just pretty huge. And so, I love to say in these presentations, we don't know if any of this is going to work, right? This is all science. It's trial and error. It's using the best available data we have. But the best data that we have right now is that if we don't try, we won't have salmon in 20 years from now. And so these kind of radical high investment projects are really kind of actualizing that sober understanding. And beyond that, if we are able to monitor over time, which we will, that aquifer regeneration, the protection of cold water inputs, especially on the McKenzie, which is at a really increased risk. I think the climate model projections right now are looking at 78% decrease in snowpack inputs by the 2080s for the McKenzie Basin. McKenzie provides 30% of flow in the Columbia River when it hits, or in the Willamette River when it hits the Columbia in the summer. That snowpack reduction, along with that, and having that loss of water just kind of going through the system is not only affecting the salmon, but that's going to affect all of the folks who live downstream and rely directly on McKenzie River water here in Eugene and Springfield, but also the Willamette. So I think I would love to see people doing more work in looking at these, putting numbers to kind of what would that look like? What would us having to build new infrastructure or change things in the face of some of these climate modeling projections really be? Because I'm going to guess that those $8 million marks are going to be pretty low compared to what's already spent on salmon recovery in our area. And then looking at kind of long-term viability of having livable communities for people too. Those are my thoughts.
Well, and if you also look at too, how long have we been mitigating and artificially supplementing salmon runs because of dams through hatchery programs, and what is that price tag? You can look at this through a lot of different angles, and it's really interesting too, what's happening down in the Klamath. With that dam removal project that's slated for I think 23, 24. The FERC licensing, they can't. It costs way more money for them to try to measures to improve those dams for salmon habitat, where they've decided that it's worth it to just take those dams down because the cost for that mitigation through the FERC licensing through the dams is astronomical. So, but this first phase, if you want to specifically I think, what did you say, Elizabeth, 8 million total?
I think for the whole, that was the highest number.
Phase one is 1.8.
1.8.
We've got a question too. Somebody wondering, with these projects that you've discussed tonight, do you have an impact from nutria?
We don't have nutria up in the Finrock project area. We did pretty extensive monitoring. They're kind of everywhere. One, I would also love to see somebody research this. Anecdotally, I would say in areas like Green Island where we have nutria, increasing the quality of habitat brings in beaver and river otter, both of whom compete with nutria, and both of whom are like bigger and a little bit more feisty than nutria. So that's just anecdotal. But I would imagine when we increase habitat to where some of our native species are able to like find refuge and begin utilizing those spaces, that there are pressures and that nutria are, they're like 10 to 12 pounds and beavers are up to 60 pounds. It's kind of no competition. And then otters just rule the river environment.
Yeah, there's been evidence of beaver in Finrock project area. Kate Mayer, she's one of the Forest Service fish bios working on our project. She was just up at South Fork this last weekend and actually she was doing some snorkeling and documented a beaver. So, I mean, they're using it for sure.
Yeah, and as I said, we did pre-beaver monitoring. McKenzie River Trust has a beaver monitoring program for anyone who wants to learn all about beavers. And we did do pre-restoration monitoring, and we'll be following up post-restoration on how many more beavers we have.
Sounds sort of like you're doing the work that beavers do, only on a much more accelerated pace.
Yeah, I often let Brent and our restoration projects manager know that as soon as I can train beavers to drive the skid steer, they're out of work. They've only got those opposable thumbs going for them at this point. So
it's really impressive to see your pictures of the work in process and all the bare dirt and all the big heavy machinery, and to realize that in time that will all be gone and you won't know that happened. I think that's kind of one of the most sort of amazing aspects of this, is just now you see it and now you don't, and you don't know it was ever there.
It's definitely a really heavy-handed approach, and it's hard to see if you don't know what the benefits are. I mean, passing by, that was one of our concerns, is this project being so visible from Highway 126. Are we going to get a lot of questions, and which we haven't really. It's been good, but I mean, it's a heavy-handed approach, and it's pretty ugly, and it's you're making drastic changes, but I think if you see the results or understand the process, then it's okay.
I've got one, I think we're close to the end of the questions, but I've got one last one. I know a lot of folks like to boat along the McKenzie, and you mentioned recreational uses being something you think about. Is there some resistance though to, unchannelizing the river and letting it flow in different directions and being really shallow? I'm thinking kayakers might not mind, but maybe some of the folks with deeper keels could be. Is that a problem or a concern?
With this project, no, because the monument and elevation shouldn't actually affect the actual water moving through the McKenzie. I think the bigger concern with these projects is that we are adding in large wood into the stream, and large wood is inherently dangerous for navigational purposes. And that is, as I said, it's designed, and we're taking measures to really minimize to the much of our ability the potential that logs would move from this type of project area into areas that are being navigated for recreational purposes. But it is, it's hard. The South Fork McKenzie is somewhere where people used to fish, and it was really making a community sacrifice. It's no longer navigable to go through there safely. And so I think those are the types of hard decisions and hard conversations that we all have to be ready to have with one another around this type of work and around our relationship with the rivers.
Yeah, just to clarify, I mean, no wood is being placed in the main stem. There's actually no work being done in the main stem. So all the wood is in, side channel, off channel that we're creating. And so there's the wood placement that is adjacent to the main stem, we build those wood structures like really big so they're visible, and build them really strong, to kind of, you know, keep people out. Not that they would be going through there anyway.
Well, thank you so much. I think our time is up. So I definitely appreciate both Elizabeth and Brent being with us. And I'm so happy that you're looking after the beavers. And it would be interesting to hear more about your beaver monitoring program, because I know that they are critical to our waterways. And I think I read that down in Klamath that they're actually importing beavers down there. So it's good that we have enough beavers up here that we don't need to import them into our waterways. So again, thank you so much. And just want to mention that our next seminar will be coming up on September 21st. And we'll have Heiko Koster talking about applying permaculture principles to your landscape. So hopefully people can join us for that one in a month's time. So again, thank you so much, Brent and Elizabeth, for being with us tonight.
Yeah, thank you all.